Chapter 2 today. We're getting into Galatians chapter 2. We'll stay in the first half of Galatians 2 today. And just a little recap what we've gone through so far. Really, this Galatians 1 and 2, a lot of just Paul kind of telling a lot of his story, his conversion, some of his journeys to Jerusalem. And remember, the whole point of this is he's a couple things. He's trying to support his apostleship, I guess you could say. They were a lot of these Judaizing false teachers were going out, kind of bad mouthing him and saying he wasn't a true apostle, which was diminishing the gospel that he taught as well. So part of that is just to build up his credentials as an apostle, and of course a lot of the time he's also talking about how this gospel that he's preaching is he's trying to show that this is not man's gospel, but this is the gospel that I received from Jesus himself and the Holy Spirit, just like the original 12 apostles did. So he's kind of telling his story a lot. We've got a lot of time stamps throughout these first two chapters, and chapter 2 is no different. We're dealing with this period pretty much from the time of his conversion up until the through the first missionary journey, that Jerusalem Council period. This is kind of the period that he's discussing right now. And even though we have a lot of information, there's a lot of questions as to when everything kind of happens. We don't have exact dates and exact timestamps, so there's no consensus as to what each of these events, the exact ones it's talking about. So you have to do a little digging and kind of compare with the book of Acts and some things. But that's kind of the fun thing that we get to do here. So Galatians chapter 2, we'll go ahead and just read the first 10 verses that we're going to discuss today, and then we'll go back and talk about it here. It says, "Then after 14 years I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up because of a revelation, and set before them, though privately, before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. Yet, because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Jesus Christ, so that they might bring us into slavery, to them we did not yield in submission, even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. And from those who seem to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed too influential added nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do." So the first question is this 14 years that it's talked about. If you look back in toward the end of chapter 1, it mentions in verse 18 that after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas. That 3-year period he seems to be going from his conversion right there. So 3 years after his conversion, which we say probably in the range of 34 AD. So 3 years, that first visit he's talking about back in chapter 1, probably after he spends a couple years in Arabia. We're talking about that one. the question now is 14 years. You see the problem. 14 years from what? Is it 14 years after that 3-year period? So 17 years from his conversion, or is he still talking about from his conversion 14 years? So, not that it's crucial either way that we come to a consensus about that, but that's where some of these questions come. Just trying to figure out what which events are being talked about, and trying to piece together the just the time frame of Paul's life here. So just to recap here again, remember he's on his way to Damascus when he was converted. Spends about 3 years there and somewhere in Arabia. And then we talked about this last time, but he was in Jerusalem, but only for about 2 weeks or so, 15 days. And remember, he says he only saw, the only ones he actually saw then was Peter, Cephas, and James, the Lord's brother. So he didn't really spend much time in that first time he went to Jerusalem after his conversion, and he actually ends up having to kind of skip town pretty quick. So he heads to Caesarea and then up to Syria and Cilicia, which is that area kind of north, I guess northeast Mediterranean, which is his homeland right there. Remember, he's from Tarsus, and he's going to spend a lot of time there, and usually spend a lot of time in Antioch. That's going to be his kind of base of operations when he starts all of his journeys. So we've and this is kind of the main question with all these dates and years. We have 3 visits that are recorded for us in the book of Acts. We have that first one we've already talked about. That first visit was 3 years after his conversion. He only meets with Peter and James, and he remains at this point he really didn't meet anyone else in the churches there in Judea. He kind of remained unknown. The only thing he says was they had heard that he who used to persecute them is now preaching them. That's what he says there at the end of Galatians 1. So the next 2 visits that we see in the book of Acts, this is the question as to which one we're talking about here in Galatians chapter 2. There's another visit in Acts chapter 11, verses 27 and 30. He goes with Barnabas, and this was actually, him and Barnabas were appointed to bring some relief down to the churches in Judea because of a famine. That one we at least kind of can narrow down when that was, because it mentions it was during the time of Claudius, and he was the emperor at the time. And we know pretty certainly he became emperor in 41 AD. So sometime after 41 AD, we can at least narrow that one down. There was a lot of famines during the time, so you can kind of figure out about when that was. And then, of course, his next visit that is mentioned in Acts is going to be in Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council, appointed alongside Barnabas and others to go to Jerusalem to the apostles regarding the question of circumcision. So that's the big question in Galatians chapter 2. Which of these 2 visits are we talking about here? Not super clear, so it doesn't matter too much. But it helps to get some context a little bit here. I'm kind of leaning toward not the Jerusalem Council visit that he's talking about here, but I won't fault you. I won't fault you either way. The main thing we see here is that he brings Titus along with him, and of course we know Titus from the book of Titus. That's who he's talking about. And what's interesting about Titus? Why is he the perfect case study to bring along on this trip? He's a Gentile. So he didn't grow up a Jew, therefore he has not been Circumcised, yeah. So this is a perfect opportunity to, he's kind of a perfect case study to see what's going to happen when you have bring this guy along. He's not circumcised. Will he be accepted? Will he be brought in to the fold, I guess, by the apostles and the church there in Jerusalem or not? That's the main thing. Actually, I didn't realize. I'm familiar with the book of Titus. We know that, but I didn't realize just how often Titus kind of pops up throughout the Bible. He was apparently really tight with Paul. Of course, we know he was a Greek and a Gentile. Probably converted by Paul at some point, because he calls him a true child in the common faith. So he was like a son to Paul in a sense. That's what he called him in Titus chapter 1, verse 4. Of course, he accompanies Paul to Jerusalem here in Galatians 2. But later on, he's mentioned a lot in the Corinthian letters. Titus went to Corinth to serve the church, so he would spend a lot of time in Corinth, and I think he even mentions there in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 that it was during Paul's third missionary journey. He arrived in Troas expecting Titus to be there, and then he ends up rejoining Paul in Philippi and gave him a good report of the work in Corinth, I believe. Oh yeah, Titus actually was the one that delivers the book of the second letter to the Corinthians. He's the one that delivers it to the Corinthians, and then was instrumental in doing and collecting and organizing the collection for the saints that's mentioned in that book as well. Later on, when you read the book of Titus, seems to come a little later. It seems like Paul left Titus in Crete to appoint elders. Then he tells him, as soon as a couple of these other guys are coming, as soon as they get there, come join me in Nicopolis, which is in western Greece, while Paul spends the winter there. And he was apparently with Paul in Rome during his final imprisonment, because he's mentioned in 2 Timothy, which is probably one of the last books or the last letters that Paul wrote. It mentioned he sends him to evangelize in Dalmatia, which is like modern day Serbia or Yugoslavia, that area. So he's mentioned several times in several books throughout the New Testament. So a very, very close relationship with Paul. So it's and he calls him a partner and a fellow worker. He returns to Corinth with much enthusiasm, and on his own initiative, he was, just nothing but glowing things that Paul says about Titus. And of course, we'll see here he is not forced to be circumcised. Spoiler alert if you haven't read the rest of Galatians chapter 2 here. So look at this again. We're back to Galatians chapter 2. Look at this story again. He goes up because of the revelation that is set before them, in order to make sure that I was not running or had not run in vain. What does he mean by that? He's taken Titus up to Jerusalem after 14 years. He's going to, because of the revelation he's set before, he's going to meet privately with those that seemed influential, and basically tell them the gospel that he's preaching in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. What does he mean by that? Is all his work that he's been doing, has it been in vain? Or how would it become vain?
I don't think he's saying that he's questioning whether or not his gospel is correct.
Yeah.
I think it's like saying that I was doing all this work. Maybe Brother Larry was telling me last night, but somebody was telling me, like if you're digging the hole and somebody else is filling it in at the same time, you're working and you know you're doing your part, but
Yep.
it's not getting you anywhere. And if he was teaching one thing and the people in Jerusalem were teaching something else, then they were not getting anywhere. And they needed to make sure that it was right. But I don't think it has anything to do with him being uncertain about the message that he received from Christ.
I would agree. Yeah, he's not saying like, okay, everything I've done was wrong or in vain or something. He's making sure that all his work doesn't get undone by disunity, I guess. Yes, sir.
He's making the argument, even though he's been accused that his apostleship is not on par with those of Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
If he goes back and finds out that they're indeed in conflict, with what he's saying, then it's going to look to him as if, what he's been doing is in vain, because his argument is, I'm every bit of an apostle as they are.
Exactly.
I didn't receive it by man. If he goes back and there's a conflict, then they're going to claim he indeed has received it by man and not by God. So it would look as if he had been running in vain.
Yes, sir. Brother Howard.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it looks like too, the next sentence sort of helps clear it up as well, because he goes on and talks about Titus not being circumcised. And then he goes on and talks about, you got highlighted there, the false brethren.
Yep.
He's again, turning back to that.
So that's kind of the result of this meeting. Go back just a second. I'd like to kind of highlight how he goes about this, which I think is interesting. Notice he sets before them talking about. He talks about those of influence. So I think he's talking about the apostles, Peter and James and all those guys. But notice he does this privately. He's not just going to come, barreling in and just be like, all right, this is the gospel. You guys better get on board. Or, he's not forcing it. He wants to make sure that he's going to meet with them privately and make sure there actually isn't any disunity or any conflict with what he knows to be the true gospel. But if there is, if the other apostles aren't, if they are succumbing to these Judaizing teachers that are saying you have to also be circumcised and also follow the law of Moses to be saved, then everything he's taught is in vain, because, the gospel isn't being preserved, he'll say later. So that's what's important to him. It's not that he's saying, well, I hope I'm right about this. Let me check in with the actual apostles and make sure. That's not the point. He's wanting to make sure that they also have come to the same conclusions about salvation and the gospel and the necessity or lack thereof of circumcision and all that.
He was speaking to these brothers to maintain unity
Mm-hmm.
in the church, that make sure that they're all on the same page about presenting the gospel.
Yeah, and that's the lesson for us, is you can be right and go about things the wrong way. He was right. I think we would agree. The gospel he was preaching the correct gospel. But if he'd have come in and had this discussion in the wrong way, then that would have caused problems that would have made that gospel or his running in vain. But verse 3, but even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. So it seems like they come to an agreement with the apostles. Again, some people think this is the Jerusalem Council. To me, it just doesn't sound like the same time. Having this big council and all that. It seems like this is a little before that, and then later on you have the Jerusalem Council and you have this major consensus, but this seems to be a little smaller scale than that just so far.
This might even, if this were the second visit,
Mhm.
Acts 11 visit, even though Paul is writing this letter
Yeah.
You know, he's telling about those
Mhm.
days. And so this was still early on, before all the, if that's the visit, this is before the Antioch
Yeah.
church, you know, growth spurt,
Mhm.
you know, all of that. So I think this is right. He's kind of looking back to how did I get the gospel and how did I relate to
Yeah.
the Jerusalem apostles?
Look there at verse 4. It talks about these false brothers brought in secretly to spy out our freedom so that they might bring us back into slavery. You get the sense that it seems to me like there's a pretty good consensus between Paul and the apostles, but it's others that are having to use more secret and subversive means to try to get their point across and do that. But it's interesting. They're called false brothers. You know, are these? Some people would say, well, are these if they're preaching false? If they're false teaching, then are they truly Christians? Are they brothers at all? Well, I mean, I guess you can be a brother, but also be teaching things that are wrong as well. And I mean, the kind of strong language here, they slipped in to spy out our freedom, that they might bring us back into slavery. But he does not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. I love that language. Kind of shows what to me it shows our duty to preserve and to pass on the gospel to our children and our friends and family and all that. If we allow that gospel to be changed or subverted, or we give in to these false brothers or whatever, these false teachings, then that we've allowed that the gospel to be changed, and we have not preserved it like we've not preserved the truth like we should. So it gives us a duty to make sure that we know the gospel, right? And then make sure we are passing on the truth of the gospel. Not that the gospel can ever be, truly changed, but for us, if we allow false teaching into our group or into the church, then we have not. We're going back. We're heading back into slavery. We're letting those false brothers or false teachings slip in. So this is, we think, what's the big deal about all this? Well, this is a very big deal. If that true gospel is not preserved, then like he says, all his work is in vain. What's the point of everything he's done to this point?
Well, and he's bringing home that message that the Christian salvation is a gift of God, and these false brothers are wanting to put that, gives them legalism about
Yep.
being circumcised, and what, like you said, he was talking about being put in slavery. They wanted to hold him in bondage
Mm-hmm.
to that Jewish teaching.
See, what was it? I guess it was during the Jerusalem Council, when they were advising, like, we don't want to add any more burden to you than the 3 or 4 things they said. Stay away from sexual immorality and things like that. It was the law of Moses and all those things. That was a burden that, even the Jews couldn't bear properly. They weren't able to. So to try to bring that onto these Gentile Christians or these Greek Christians, It would be like binding them, bringing them into slavery, and it's interesting. Paul was a Jew. He was circumcised already. So honestly, for him. What's done is done. It wouldn't really matter for him he's already circumcised. He could just say, well, I'll let the Tituses of the world and the Timothys and all these other guys, I'll let them deal with it. But no, he knew that he had to make sure that that the truth of the gospel was preserved. And what is the truth? It was, the fact that it's through faith in Christ, not through the works of the law, that man is saved. And that's the main issue. That's the whole problem. Is they were saying, okay, they weren't saying that, Jesus wasn't resurrected, or Jesus didn't exist or something. It wasn't that. They were saying, okay, you got to believe in Jesus, have faith in him, and be circumcised and follow the law of Moses to be saved. If they wanted to be circumcised and follow those things of their own accord, fine. But when they were saying, okay, that's a necessary part of salvation, that's where the issue, that's where the truth of the gospel was being perverted. Yeah.
And it will also mean that Jesus died in vain.
Exactly. Yeah. There's that word of in vain again. Yeah. Like what was if.
If they were wanting them to say that Jesus dying on the cross meant nothing,
Mm-hmm.
you had to have the Jewish
Yep.
law applied to have salvation.
Mm-hmm. So that was pretty serious false teaching that needed to be refuted. Kind of two interesting case studies here. We have Titus and Timothy, and this is another time where you see Paul's wisdom. So in the case of Titus, on the right there, he's a Greek Gentile, and Paul keeps him from he didn't have to be circumcised. But then we also see in Acts chapter 16, he has Timothy, who was half Greek and half Jew. He has him circumcised. So you're kind of thinking, okay, that's it's kind of a conflict there. Like, why did Paul have Timothy later on circumcised? If it wasn't necessary, then why did he have him circumcised? And then, he made sure that Titus didn't have to be circumcised to be part of the group there. And I like these two verses there in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 20 and 21. In verse 20 it says, "To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law." And then verse 21, "To those outside the law," talking about the Greeks and Gentiles, "I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law." So you can see he's doing whatever he can to bring anyone to Christ, to teach the gospel. If he's going to the Jews, then he's going to act as a Jew, do whatever he needs to, just to not cause any more trouble than he needs to.
It's basically to get his foot in the door.
Yeah, exactly.
He's not trying to throw up a barrier right at the beginning.
Yep.
That would cause that they wouldn't listen to him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think seems like that's why.
Yeah, so he's not saying like, okay, well, Timothy needed to be circumcised, so he wasn't changing his mind with Timothy. He was just saying, okay, well, we're gonna be preaching to a lot of Jews in this area. We better get you circumcised, because they're gonna they're not going to let you in the door. They're going to take offense at your being a Jew and not circumcised. So let's just do that. That way we don't have to, we don't have to worry about anything.
Removing obstacles.
Yeah, we're just removing obstacles that, you don't want any more trouble than you need to. And then, okay, we're going to the Greeks. Then, I became as one outside the law. He's still under the law of Christ. That's another thing we'll see in the book of Galatians. Well, and even nowadays, people use Galatians to say, all right, he's talking about you don't have to follow any laws at all. Like, no, Galatians is talking about more specifically the law of Moses and circumcision. There's still the law of Christ. I mean, there are still things that we need to do to obey. And he talks about that here. But, notice his goal. He's trying to win those under the law. He's trying to win those outside of the law. Wherever you fall, whatever genealogy, whatever nationality you are, he's trying to win those to Christ. Whatever he needs to do, I kind of liken it to if I'm visiting another congregation and they want me to, maybe they wanted me to preach, and in that congregation they always wear a suit and tie or something. Why am I going to go there in a polo and just cause trouble for myself? No, I'm going to wear a suit and a tie. Is that necessary? Is there some rule is there a law in the Bible that says that? Of course not. But, why would I not do that and just cause, undue stress and trouble for myself? I'm happy to wear a suit and tie or whatever if I needed to. The whole point is, here Galatians 5:6, for in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything. It don't matter. Be circumcised, don't be circumcised. That's not the point here. Only faith working through love. And that's the gospel he's teaching right now. He's teaching a gospel of faith, working through love, in Christ Jesus. Doesn't matter if you're circumcised or not. If you're circumcised, that doesn't mean you're, a level 5 Christian, and the uncircumcised are level 4. That don't matter at all. And I think that's part of the issue. Of course, the Jews, they were God's people, right? They've been God's people for generations. Even Christ first preached to the Jew first, and then he preached to the Jews first. So the Jews kind of had an inflated sense of their firstborn status in God's eyes, I guess. And Paul's trying to say, hey, let's lower that a bit.
So someone might ask the question, it doesn't mean anything, circumcision, uncircumcision, and we should be doing, faith working through love, then why didn't Paul just have Titus be circumcised?
I was gonna ask you the same question, just to see what you say.
Why not?
So now I'm gonna answer his question since he asked it.
Mhm.
The conditions under which each one of these men were teaching were different.
Mhm.
First of all, Timothy, being half Jew, to be accepted by Jews, would have had been circumcised. If
Yeah.
he's going in to teach someone that did not understand Christ at all, the Messiah had already come, they would not have listened to him without circumcision.
Yeah.
They just wouldn't have, because he wasn't keeping the law. Now, we know that Timothy was taught by his mother and his grandmother what it meant to be a Jew. Titus, on the other hand, was a Greek. A Greek a Gentile of any nature would have had to go through a lot more steps to be accepted as a Jew.
Mhm.
His calling never
And-
But if you talk about vain, to have someone circumcised, just to be circumcised so he can talk to the Jew and the Jew won't listen, that's vain. That's why he didn't need to be circumcised.
And the timing too, when Timothy's circumcised, I believe that's during the second missionary journey there in Acts chapter 16, several years later after the fact. I think part of it too with Titus here is a point needs to be made. You know, at some point you have to butt heads a little bit. This whole problem is happening right now. You know, do they need to be circumcised or not? Well, this is a perfect time to say no. He doesn't have to be circumcised. I mean, they're already having the issue there. So to have Titus circumcised doesn't avoid. I mean, they're talking about that exact issue right now. So.
Seems they were, certain ones were trying to compel him to be circumcised.
Yeah.
This had to be, in Acts 15, this is a condition of salvation. You couldn't be saved unless you did that. So it seems like they were trying to force
Yeah,
this.
trying to force it. And he talks in verse 5 of Galatians 2, you know, we did not yield in submission to them. So this wasn't an example of just trying to avoid undue conflict or undue trouble, like in the case of Timothy. This was, do we yield to this false teaching in this instance or not? So of course,
That's the thing, I think. Cannot yield someone that is trying to change the gospel,
Yes.
trying to change the word.
exactly.
You know, it doesn't matter if you're trying to be in love or that, you can't compromise what God said
Mhm.
to begin with. Or you're destroying. Think about what that would have done if he would have said, okay, yeah, let's get him, let's get him done. Then they would have, oh yeah, that's the,
Yep.
no, can't.
Well, they were trying to bind where it wasn't bound.
Yep.
We have that same problem.
I was gonna say, as I get into all this, like, you know, obviously we don't have the issue of being circumcised or not anymore, but just the nature of this conflict and how it went about, and then how Paul handles it in different ways depending on different circumstances. I mean, I can see lots of, I can see just the tactics that are used and draw parallels to other, you know, modern conflicts that we might have in the church today. So, yes, sir.
Even when you go back and look at the reference made there in Acts chapter 16 in verse 3, mine reads as the New Century Version, says, Paul wanted Timothy to travel with him, but all the people in the area knew that Timothy's father was a Greek. So Paul had circumcised Timothy to please his mother's people.
Mhm.
It wasn't to bring him in correct,
Yeah.
I guess, bindings of the law. It was just so that they would understand. They knew he was a Jew and that he should have been circumcised.
Yeah.
Had he been a Jew.
And they were just, I mean, trying to teach the gospel. They weren't necessarily having to worry about the, you know, be circumcised or not question. So why bring that up? Let's just avoid that one. Let's focus on teaching the gospel while they were on that trip. Continue to the last half here. And from those who seem to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. And you'll notice Paul keeps talking about the apostles here, you know, the pillars and those who seemed influential, but he's he's not raising them up in any way. He's trying to keep everyone the same, and I think that's the main issue right here. Jews, people like to have different levels and different status, you know, Jews and then Greeks, or apostles and, you know, Paul or whatever.
Yeah, some of the other translations in that seem to be influential say of high reputation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so let me think about it. And everybody were looking to them,
Yeah.
you know, as the pillars of the church and other things. And so, and if you go back to the earlier verses, I think that's another reason why he went to him in private. He's trying to do it the right way.
Yeah.
He's not trying to get up in there and bust up
Mm-hmm.
and cause a big splash, but he's just trying to do the right thing in teaching the gospel.
And he's saying, he says, and who seemed influential, added nothing to me. He's also, again, still trying to show that he is an apostle of the same level, the same vein as Peter and James and John and all those guys. He has been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised. He's been given a mission, and not that he can't preach to Jews and Peter can't preach to Gentiles, but they've been entrusted. They've been given a mission. They've been given a duty to go to certain areas. For he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. They're both getting their marching orders from the same place, right? Holy Spirit from Christ. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. So they come to an agreement. And again, this he's only talking about these three: James, Cephas, and John. Doesn't seem like it's the full all 12 apostles or however many are there at the time. So it seems to be a smaller gathering than maybe that Jerusalem council was. That's just my opinion. But they come to an agreement too in verse 10. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. That seems to be kind of strange right there at the end. They're like, okay, yeah, that's right. You've got you're doing great. You're preaching the gospel to the Gentiles. We're preaching the gospel to the Jews. Only don't forget about the poor. What does that have to do with anything?
I think the Jewish Christians that were faithful sacrificed a lot. In
Yeah.
the first century. It cost them a lot. All their Jewish brethren, Jewish former brethren, were really hard on them. The others were hard on them, and so they sacrificed a lot. And I think maybe they're saying, please remember us.
Yeah.
Remember all of them. And of course, that's what Paul does.
I was going to say, and if this is that second trip, that's actually why Paul was coming down anyway, was to bring relief from Antioch to the Jewish Christians in Judea that was going through a famine. So, but did Paul remember the poor? Well, yeah. I mean, look at all the times he's pretty much everywhere he's going. He's pulling up a collection for the churches in Judea. 1 Corinthians 16, he's directing the churches in Galatia, so you are also to do, on the first day of the week, take a collection, and then I'll take it to Jerusalem. If you want to send some other guys to accompany me, that's great. When he writes to the Romans, I'm going to Jerusalem, bringing aid to the saints. The churches in Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution to the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. So even though he's going to the Gentiles, he's not forgetting these poor saints that were kind of suffering more than the ones in Jerusalem were probably suffering the most, I would say, either through famine or persecution from both Jews and Gentiles. Seemed like a lot of the other places, they're in more Gentiles. I don't know how much, as much persecution was going on, because you had different gods and different religions all over the place, so they were just another one to a lot of the people there. But those poor saints in Jerusalem were going through a lot there. And then that gets us right to chapter 11, or chapter 2 and verse 11. We'll start that on Sunday, but we're going to see that still some issues there. Even Peter, you can see why there was this discussion. Even Peter sometimes is going to not follow Paul's lead and kind of or push away from the Gentiles a little bit. So we'll get to that next week. Any final questions or thoughts on first half of chapter 2? All right, thank you so much.